A recent survey found that 54% of Scottish people at the moment would be in favour of independence. So clearly there is something going on, even if it's not the same level of oppression that we can see in Ireland, etc. So here to explore these issues are Sandy McBurney and Steve Freeman. The format of this will be that Sandy is going to speak 15 minutes, perhaps around that time, then Steve for 15 minutes, and then we can open up for comments and questions from the floor. So the first one to speak is Sandy. Hello.
Okay, hi there. I want to put forward the position that socialists should oppose the campaign for Scottish independence because it's not in the interest of the working class to see the British working class broken up by nationalism. I think it is important, though, that the Socialists and the Left and the Labour Party does take a position to support the right of the Scottish Parliament to decide.
Sorry, Sandy, there is actually something a bit wrong with your microphone. It's really quiet. I wonder if you could go a bit closer to it.
Right. Is that any better?
That's better, yes, thank you.
Okay, I want to argue that Socialists should oppose the campaign for Scottish independence. I put up some articles on the discussion list, one by myself and one by Neil Davidson, and Neil Davidson's arguing for support for Scottish independence, and I put forward the position that I wrote back 6 years ago at the time of the first independence referendum. So although I think socialists should oppose Scottish independence, I think we should take a strong stand to support the right of the Scottish Parliament to call an Indie Ref 2 if it so desires. If the majority MSPs vote for that, there should be no obstruction from Westminster for such a poll to take place. And it's important that socialists throughout Britain take a stand to say that it is the democratic right of the Scottish people to decide if they want to be independent or not. So I think that's an important point. But why then do I oppose the SNP-led campaign for Scottish independence? Well, first, just a bit of background. I mean, the British working class movement, maybe the first movement of the working class internationally. It's got 200 years of history, joint struggle of workers in Scotland, England and Wales against the British capitalist class. When the working class has won victories, it's won them by joint struggle. Winning the vote for women, winning the National Health Service, etc. These have been won by united movement, a movement not divided on grounds of nationality, but a movement that is fighting for the interests of all workers in Britain. And the British working class consists of anyone who works in Britain. So it's not a question of it being some form of nationalism. You can be Polish and part of the British working class. As long as you work here, you're part of the British working class. You don't even need to be able to speak English, but if you work here, you are. So I think it's important that we can see that the victories that we've had in the past have been because of common struggle of all workers in Britain, and obviously internationally as well, as the British working class movement is part of the international movement, just as you have a German working class movement, a French working class movement. One of the points I would want to make is that to divide the British working class along the grounds of nationality would weaken the working class here. And that's one of the reasons that we should oppose it. And it's also the tradition of the socialist movement in Britain is to fight for a workers' government in Britain, not to have a devolution or separation, but to fight for a workers' government. And then obviously you can look to the writings of Lenin, Trotsky, Marx, Engels. None of them raised the demand for Scottish independence, and none of them viewed Scotland as an oppressed nation. And I think that is an obvious starting point. Scots are not oppressed for being Scots. There's no division between the working class living standards in England and Scotland and Wales. We face a common enemy and we have common organisations. And in the past, we've built these organisations together. The Labour Party, the Independent Labour Party, the Communist Party, the Chartist movements, they were all British-wide movements. My point is that when the working class is moving forward, it does it as a collectivity in Britain. It doesn't divide. So, the rise of the SNP, where does it come from? I mean, originally quite a right-wing movement. It was in the 20s, partly set up by Tories, and it was a very much a fringe movement until we get to the 60s, and then it starts to take off. Partly it takes off with the discovery of oil and the fact that a section of the Scottish establishment can see that oil as a valuable resource that gives the potential for an escape route for the Scottish middle class and sections of the ruling class from declining Britain, where you had a situation in Britain that was striped. The working class was really moving forward at that point. The SNP was starting to grow and starting to say, no, it's Scotland's oil. We take that resource. We can build a society that would be successful apart from the stripe torn Britain. So it's got quite right-wing origins, but it did move to the left, and it has moved to the left, certainly in its presentation. Obviously, it has to do that, or it wouldn't win the support that it has from workers, right? But my point is that the discovery of the oil was part of the rise of the SNP. The other part was the defeat of the British working class, the defeats that were suffered in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as the working class is defeated, for instance, the miners' strike defeat, the defeat of the Bennite movement in the Labour Party, there's a certain demoralisation. And when you get that demoralisation, you get a growth in support for the SNP. Because workers in Scotland start to lose faith in the Labour movement, in the British Labour movement, delivering gains and reforms, and start to look towards the SNP and its promises for improvements in Scotland if only we can get independence. So that's an important point from my point of view, is that it's a strange kind of movement that draws strength from the defeats of the working class, right? It's not a socialist movement there. It's the nationalist character of the SNP is obvious, and that it draws its political strength from the defeats of the British working class. And that's partly when we've seen Corbyn coming about, that was a bit of a blow for the SNP.
Sandy, sorry, there's commenting about the sound being quite bad. I wonder if you could either go a bit closer to your microphone or if there's any...
Right. Can you hear me any clearer?
Yes, that's better. Yes, thank you.
Now, let's get back to what I was saying there. Right? That my point is that when the working class suffers setbacks in Britain, that's when you've seen growth of the SNP. It's a movement that is based on despair at the prospects for the working class. And that's why when Corbyn came about, and the Corbyn movement that offered some hope to the left in Britain, there was a certain decline amongst the vanguard of the working class in Scotland for support for the SNP. It wasn't massive. There wasn't a massive influx to the Labour Party, but there was a development of a left that could look to Corbyn and the British working class as being an attempt to fight back against austerity. So that's one point. I mean, I think it has to be accepted that Scotland's not in the First Nation, a point already made. So what is the project that the SNP is putting forward? It's an independent capitalist Scotland, right? And if you look at what they were putting forward in the 2014 referendum, it was certainly within the politics of neoliberalism. They were looking at, one of the main policies was a 3% cut in corporation tax to whatever the tax level is in the rest of Britain. So they were basically trying to attract companies here, as happens throughout Europe. They're trying to attract companies here because of lower taxes in companies. They've been in government now for, 13 years in Scotland, and they've been implementing austerity. That's the reality of it. There's some left talk, but the reality of it is they've been implementing cuts in working class living standards in Scotland. There's been no big fightbacks led by the SNP. They obviously prefer the working class to be quiescent. They're looking for a situation where they manage to, through despair, win workers to support independent capitalist Scotland, which would mean, as George Caravan, one of the so-called lefts within the SNP, would have 5 years of hard austerity after independence, and then we would be in a position to launch our own currency, etc. So it's a nationalist prospect. It's not a prospect based on anti-capitalism. And it's obviously disappointing and even tragic to see so many former socialists joining the SNP and supporting the nationalist politics of the SNP. One example, just in the last few days, we had a bill at the Scottish Parliament arguing for the rent controls, and that was sponsored by the Labour Party, by Colin McNeill, and the SNP managed to quash that in the alliance of the Tories. They won't support rent control because they are not a pro-working class party. So I think the reality of the SNP is not a party that fights for the interests of working class people. And the traditional socialist position has been we need a united working class in Britain to fight for a workers' government. Obviously part of an international movement. You don't move towards international unity of the working class by dividing on national grounds, one of the oldest working class movements on the planet. So that is one of the reasons I think that you should be very wary of giving any credit to the left talk from the SNP. When you look into it, you'll find that they implement policies that are in the interests of capitalism. Now, what would be the process of the divorce? As I've said, every right for the Scottish Parliament to call an Indie Ref 2, although it has been observed in Scotland that actually the SNP are quite comfortable in the present circumstances, in that they've been in power for 13 years. They've all, the SNP is in a position to give jobs and quangos, etc., to its supporters, and there's quite a layer of those now in Scotland after 13 years. So they're quite comfortable with that. And the prospects for independence, given the world situation, the fact that we are in a major crisis of capitalism, the prospects of an independent Scotland, really, it would be quite harsh, I would say. In this time, unlike 2014, when you could possibly argue that the divorce would have been amicable, since both Scotland and the remains of the UK would still be in the European Union, and there'd be open borders, etc. But now the fact is, if Scotland went independent, they would be in a position where they've said they want to try and join the European Union. So there'd be a harbour border with England, and that's the major trading partner, obviously, of Scottish industry. So you've been in a situation also where the British ruling class are very hostile to independence. And I think that if you've got a situation where the Scots people voted for independence, the divorce negotiations will be very, very hostile, and there will be a growth of aggressive nationalism on both sides of the border. You can see it to some degree. Obviously, Scottish nationalism is not of the character of English nationalism, where you see it where it's really quite a right-wing movement, and that's not the case with Scottish nationalism, but there is a core there that could move in a right-wing direction. I don't know if you've seen the people protesting that we need a hard border at the moment to stop English people coming up here due to Corona. That's a small fringe thing at the moment, but there is a dynamic towards national conflict in a situation where an independent capitalist Scotland would be in a tight corner, and Westminster would be quite hostile to that independence, right? So I think that, it's dangerous. Nationalism has a dangerous dynamic. And I think it's far better for socialists to emphasise what we have in common in Britain in terms of the British working class movement, and propose a programme that applies for all workers in Britain, advances that we can make, rather than throw in our lot with the Scottish establishment and say workers should support that, because that nationalism will be used to justify cuts and attacks on working class living standards. You've seen that before with the pro-capitalist independence movements. That's the way it is. And there's no doubt that the SNP are very dominant in the independence movement in Scotland. The other people are just bit players or add-ons. The SNP are tightly controlled and dominate the independence movement. And it is disappointing to see so many ex-leftists echoing the SNP line, which tends to blame Westminster but not capitalism for the attacks that take place on working class living standards. So I'm very much for the need for a British-wide socialist party. The very fact that some ex-socialists in Scotland oppose that now is a sign of the development of nationalism. The fact that they now say we don't want to be in a common socialist party with a communist to the south of the border, we want a Scottish left party, not a British left party. I think that itself shows a certain nationalist dynamic. Anyhow, the record of the SNP, Congress can look at that themselves, but it's not been a record of in any way pro-working class government. It's been implementing austerity. It's very authoritarian. Changes are made to democratic rights, etc. They were trying recently to abolish the right of jury trial that we have in Scotland. There is definitely a dynamic. And also, if you look at the Salmon trial and the forces behind that, you can certainly see very authoritarian elements within the SNP. And there is resistance to that. There is a division within the SNP at the moment, but it's kept underground. But there is the potential that movement could split in the future. My point would be that we should not be supporting the more militant nationalists who want to go all out for independence now. We should simply be saying you get the right to vote for it, but we think in the interests of the working class we should keep a common, united British working class movement fighting for a workers' government in Britain. Now, I don't know, how long have I got?
Sandy, I would suggest that because the audio is getting worse and then a bit better, I suggest that maybe Steve speaks now, and that when you come back, you perhaps use your mobile phone if that's possible, and phone in.
Yes, I'll try and go on the mobile. Can I just make one last point, right? If you can hear me. The last point was that the last time of the referendum, there was quite a strong radical independence movement led by ex-far leftists. And they adopted the slogan, "Britain is for the rich, Scotland can be ours." And I just want to make the obvious point, there will be no socialist transformation in Scotland on its own. If there's going to be any move forward in Britain, it will be a British-wide movement. There's no way that the working class can take power in Scotland separate from the working class taking power in the rest of Britain. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Sorry about the audio issues there, comrades. I think comrades did probably pick up on Sandy's main points. I agree with him. Socialism in one country is, in fact, the opposite of socialism. It does not work and it should not be pursued. And anybody says it can be done is lying, is delusional. On the other hand, clearly there's something going on in Scotland, and a lot of comments in the chat here are calling for, should we not explore a federal solution, which is exactly why we've invited Steve Freeman, who does indeed have the outlook of a federal republic, which I agree with as well. So we get to hear from him. If you want to ask questions or contribute, please go to participants on the bottom of your screen and then click the blue hand. That means raise hand, and then you can then I can bring you in to speak after Steve has spoken for about 15 minutes. So thank you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Now I'm muted. Sorry, yep. Unmute myself. I think I am unmuted.
Yes,
myself.
you are.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, thanks, Tina. I'll take a slightly different approach. Although a lot of the observations that Sandy made, I'd agree with. I don't think they necessarily disagree with some of those. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Labour Party, whereas Sandy's tended to focus on the SNP. And I wanted to ask the question, can Scotland become a self-governing, democratic, secular and social republic where the sovereignty or authority rests with the Scottish people? And if that's possible, how can it come about? And as Tina mentioned, I've always favoured the idea of a federal republic, but I've now come to believe that actually waiting for England to get its act into gear would be a long-term thing. We're more likely to get to federalism if Scotland was to take the high road and leave us on the low road where we're presently sitting. But I wanted to begin with two things. One was with reference to Marx's views on Ireland, because Marx, of course, was very active on the Irish question in the 1860s and 70s. But he never viewed it as purely an Irish matter. For him, it was also very much about England. And he believed that England would never be free or democratic whilst Ireland was held in bondage. So keeping the union with Ireland depended on and was supported by a reactionary coalition of classes in England. This reactionary bloc did not just, was not just within the ruling class, but extended backwards to sections of the working class. And this meant that reaction was strong in England, and it enabled the ruling class to mobilize anti-Irish attitudes, and therefore to divide the working class. As we've just seen recently, of course, over Brexit, the way working class has been divided by that particular issue. So Irish independence was not simply about freeing Ireland from landlordism, but politically breaking the reactionary unionist coalition in England, and therefore transforming the prospects for radical change or revolution in England. So we have to think of it not just as a purely Scottish question, but it's also about, very much about the future of England. And we have to be able to think the other side of the coin, as it were, the Scottish side. We have to think of the English side of the same coin, because we are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. Some people will say, of course, well, of course, Ireland in the 1860s is nothing like Scotland in 2020, and that's obviously true. But that's to miss the point I'm making, which is it's not just a Scottish question. It is a Scottish question and an English question, because it's about the future of England as well. And of course, as Democrats and internationalists in England or Wales or Ireland, we support Scotland's right to self-determination. I've always supported that position. I support Scotland's right to be able to, our constitution doesn't allow Scotland to decide these things. So, you know, it doesn't exist as a right in this country under our constitution. But that doesn't, we still have to decide whether the movement in Scotland is a progressive movement or a reactionary movement. If it's a progressive movement, then we should find the proper way to support it. If it's a reactionary movement, then obviously we should oppose it. And not simply by listening to the hubris of the Scottish nationalists, but by working out the impact on the working class across the UK. And because don't forget, in England, the biggest part of the working class in the UK is in England. That's where the most powerful section of the working class is. I do believe that if Scotland became an independent republic, this would spell the end of the Tory party. It would be the end of the constitutional monarchy, or not immediately, but it would be logically what would happen. And it would open up politics in England in a way that we have not seen. So you can see why I'm therefore seeing the movement in Scotland as a progressive movement, and something that we in England should not be sitting on the fence. We should be supporting the principle of self-determination, absolutely, whatever we think, whoever we are. But I think we have to sit, not merely observe it as something progressive, but actually actively intervene, as Marx did in England when talking about the Irish question. He was in England, but he was talking about Ireland. I'm in England because I'm sitting here in London, and we're talking about Scotland. Okay, and that's a fundamental thing. Now, just for a little, how are we doing, Tina, time-wise? I'm not okay yet. Anyway, I just remembered the dead parrot story. Do you remember the dead parrot? Monty Python sketch, and remember that? Customer comes into the pet shop, the owner says, we're closing for lunch. John Cleese as a customer says, never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot, which I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique. And Michael Palin, the owner, says, oh, yes, you mean the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it? So Cleese replies, well, I tell you what's wrong with it, my lad. He's dead. That's what's wrong with it. And of course, the owner says, no, it's resting. To which Cleese replies, look, matey, I know a dead parrot when I see one, and I'm looking at one right now. And I think I'm telling you, or I'm going to suggest to you, that the Labour Party in Scotland is a dead parrot. And I think my old friend Sandy, in his role as a dodgy pet owner, wants to convince you that Labour Party is only resting, not dead. But I think there's some very good reason to see why the Labour Party in Scotland is dead, and to understand the nature of the period we're in. And that makes a big difference for the whole of socialist politics as well. Now, I read the Labour report, the Labour Together report on the general election, which speaks about Labour suffering a historic defeat. And I agree with that. Labour has suffered not just a big defeat, but an historic defeat. And it said that Labour was wiped out in Scotland. It now has one MP. The report says Labour retained just 51% of its 2017 vote and collapsed to its worst ever vote share. After losing 6 of its 7 seats in Scotland, Labour is now the third party in Scotland, and the Tories have taken second place. which is very surprising in some ways, since we used to think Scotland was like a Tory-free zone, you know, that suddenly they're now the second party in Scotland. So Labour has in effect become an Anglo-Welsh party. And if you want me to argue why that is not just a temporary setback, you know, before the pendulum swings back the other way, why the parrot is not resting, is actually dead, then how can we say that Labour's finished in Scotland? It's finished in Scotland unless it makes a radical change of direction, which is incapable of doing without destroying its own rationale or reason to exist. So it's not, there's no way out for it, but it can't take the path that it would need to do. The reasons for the death of Scottish Labour are both historical and immediate. On the historical side, and this ties in with the national question, on the historical side, I want to identify three significant periods. Number one, which is Sandy went back into history like me, but I'm going to go back to some further history. So one is the Glorious Revolution from 1688 to 1707, and I date it to that 20-year period. The Act of Union in 1707 completes the Glorious Revolution and creates the Union, establishes the Union of England and Scotland. The second period is what I would call the rise and fall of the post-war social contract. I call it the social monarchy. From 1945 to 2008, it went up, and then it's gone down under Thatcher and Blair. They've destroyed it more or less by neoliberalism. And then the third period, the new period really, since 2008, the financial crisis, when our whole structure is now completely degenerated. So it's in that immediate last period. I'm going to talk about that because probably the time won't allow me to go back into history, but maybe it'll come up in discussion. But I'll just go back over the immediate post-2008 period to see what's happening there. The trigger for the new direction in Scottish politics, really, it was 2008, I think, was a trigger for a new direction because it's when people in England and Scotland began to lose confidence in the pantomime politics of Westminster. Scottish politics shifted from traditional Tory versus Labour, so-called class politics, to the class politics of unionism versus nationalism. Scotland looks more like Northern Ireland, which has long worked on the same dynamic of unionist versus nationalist. Unionist versus nationalist could become unionist versus Republicans. It isn't necessarily that. In the 2010 general election, the Tories had 16.7% of the vote. Labour still had 42% of the vote at that time. And the Liberal Democrats had 18.9%, and the SNP only had 20%. Then all of a sudden, so that's what's happened. They come out, it sort of seems strong. Then suddenly, they in the 2011, I might have got my facts wrong on this, and I'm sure people will correct me. I think it was the 2011 Hollywood elections, where the SNP took 69 seats, Labour 37 seats, the Scottish Tories 15 seats, and so on and so forth. So in 2011, that has shifted. All of a sudden, the SNP has become the dominant party in the Scottish Parliament. Then you have the 2014 referendum, and the massive participation engagement of people in Scotland shows that something had really shifted in Scottish politics and Scottish attitudes, because although 55% was for staying in the EU, 45% is still a massive vote of no confidence in the political system of Westminster. 45% of the population. Cameron was relieved, the Queen was relieved, the ruling class was relieved, but it was a massive concern. And that's starting to divide the country between the unionist side, which has all three parties in it, Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, and the nationalist side, which is being led by the SNP. And then if we look to the 2016 referendum, what do we see there? What do we see there? What do we see there? Well, what we see there is that Scotland and Northern Ireland vote to remain in the European Union, whereas England and Wales vote to leave the European Union. There's a divide there between the Irish and the Scottish on one side of this divide and the Anglo-Welsh on the other side of this division. And not only that, the Scottish people voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union, but they were ignored. their right to decide that a very important question for themselves as a people was complete. So self-determination doesn't exist. Scotland has to follow the majority votes in England. So I think that's all added to that idea that there is no in reality, no self-determination for the Scottish people. And so this new unionist nationalist paradigm is emerging as a dividing line in Scottish politics. At first seems perverse, because it seems, why did the Tories suddenly revive themselves in this situation? Why did they revive themselves? And the answer was because the Tories are presenting themselves as the strongest, most militant unionist party. And they're making the case, they were making a strong case for the union. Labour's basically in the middle between the SNP on one side, the Tories on the other, and the Labour's being absolutely squeezed out by this polarisation between unionism and nationalism that's taking place. So in 2010, Labour had 42% of the vote. In 2015, it was down to 24%. It had dropped 20%. It rose a bit in 2017, you could call that the Corbyn bounce, before being squeezed again and falling to 18% of the vote and only one MP. So the Tories now have become the leader of militant unionism in Scotland, and Labour's moderate centre ground, where do they stand? There is no place for them in this thing. So they're being squeezed out by this. And I don't see how they can get out of that vice now, because the polarisation that is taking place. And Tina mentioned at the beginning, the recent Daily Mail shows that public opinion, the coronavirus is all added to this story, and the Boris Johnson victory in 2009 is all added to this story. The opinion in Scotland is now moving towards the idea of Scottish independence. Maybe it will go further. So, how are we doing time-wise, Tina? Because I've lost track of time. I've got quite a bit to say, but I can stop as well.
Another 5 minutes is fine.
Okay, I'll keep going then. Okay, so I wanted to sort of think about, therefore, how do socialists relate to this situation, the demise of the Labour Party and the new kind of politics, which shows Ireland and Scotland are a bit more in the same kind of frame of unionism and nationalism. Well, I'd like to say one thing. There's the class struggle approach, and I think that's the approach to take. But I understand something. If this makes sure, I probably differ maybe from Sandy over what we understand by class struggle. So let's see. So for me, there are three forms of class struggle: political, ideological, and economic. Obviously, the economic struggle is a trade union struggle, a struggle for wages and working conditions, all these other things that we all recognize. But the political struggle is essentially a struggle for democracy, for freedom, for democratic rights, for equality, for between people on race, class, sex, sexuality, religion. Like capitalism, the struggle for democracy is a global struggle, and it's taking place unevenly across the world. It's primarily taking place in nation states. It's taking place, of course, in the workplace. It's taking place in the trade union movement. And of course, as members of the Labour Left Alliance know, it's taking place, the struggle for democracy, within the Labour Party itself. But at the end of the day, it comes down to changing laws, changing constitutions, moving the game from where it's now stuck to somewhere else. The demand for proportional representation or reform of the House of Lords, that's democratic reform, but Scottish independence is the demand for a new constitution. It's actually, in that sense, it's revolutionary. It's saying, let's break with the old constitution of 1688 to 1707, and let's write ourselves some new laws, some new democratic, for a new modern democratic state. Corbyn, of course, interestingly, if you look at it, you wouldn't really remember this, but Corbyn promised, if you look at the 2017 manifesto, Corbyn talked about promising a democratic revolution in the country. They used that phrase. And then he also talked about democratic reform in the Labour Party. But of course, he's delivered neither of those things. But I think that's a terrain on which the question of Scotland has to be looked. It's on the democratic terrain. We've got to look at it from the angle of the struggle for democracy and how different classes relate to that struggle for democracy. But the working class, for me, is the most democratic driving force in the struggle for democracy. And so the working class is key for that. Now, if we come back to nationalism, if we're going to look at nationalism in the way that Sandy does, and Sandy hints at this, so let's say this. To me, there's two kinds of nationalism. There's the nationalism of the existing states, the British, the French, the Russian, the Chinese, the American, whatever. They are the state nationalisms. They're about loyalty to the state. They're about the ruling class ruling those societies. And then you have the rebellious nationalisms. Catalonia, Scotland, Hong Kong even, you know, where people are trying to get themselves more democracy than the amount of democracy that they've got. They're actually trying to change the system in some way. Kurdistan being another one, Palestine being another one. We could go on with those. But these are two quite different forms of nationalism. Now, Marxists and socialists should not support the first form, but the thing about the second form of nationalism is it contains a democratic element within it. And it's the democratic element that we support. We don't support nationalism as an idea of dividing people. We're internationalists. But the bit we support within it, the bit we're trying to find out about within it, the core bit, which is the democratic bit, that's the bit we get hold of. That's the bit we accentuate. That's the bit that we push as socialists. Because democracy and socialism are not in contradiction with one another or internationalism. That's the bit we go for. So when we look at nationalism, we don't go, nationalism is all bad and we're all internationalists. We look at those rebellious nationalisms and we look at the democratic element, which is really ultimately the working class element within that. And that's the bit that we support. And that's the bit that that's the way that Marx was thinking about Ireland in exactly the same. He was not looking at being a nationalist. He was looking at the democratic and internationalist aspects of the Irish question. Ireland in a European context, Ireland in an English context, and the struggle for democracy across these different nations. So I think that what we can see in Scotland, nationalism, which could go the way that Sandy says, into a reactionary way. There will be some reactionary nationalists who hate the English, don't get me wrong, Sandy pointed to those. But the essential core of Scottish nationalism, at this stage of its development, it may change later on, is still about democracy for Scotland. And it's that bit which is progressive, and that's why we should be supporting it. And remembering that Scotland has a direct impact on England. And if the Scottish democratic movement goes forward, and if we support that in England, by the way, then we ourselves in England will gain massively from that. Because the big danger we've got, of course, is reactionary English nationalism. That's a big thing that's lurking behind that. And that's gonna kick off against the reactionary elements, and they're gonna love each other. The reactionary elements in Scottish nationalism, the reactionary elements in English nationalism, going to war with each other. And that's not the approach that we should take. Now, again, I would like to talk about the 1707 Act of Union, Tina, but I'm again conscious of the time and wondering whether I should stop at that point. But how are we doing?
Come back in. How about we take?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the Act of Union, but I will stop there because I'd like to hear what other comrades have got to say. I think just to round it off, as it were, this story can go back to 1688 to 1707 and look at that. It can go back to the post-war settlement in 1945, and it can go back to the period after 2008, the period that we are now currently in. And I've mainly done that. I haven't talked so much. When Sandy did take us back to the miners' strike, he did take us back to Thatcher. That's part of the story too. So I don't disagree with him on that. But I will, at this point, stop, and I look forward to hearing what comrades have to say. And if I get a chance to talk about the Act of Union at some point, then I will. Thank you, Tina.
We'll get a chance. Don't worry about it. Thank you very much, Steve. That was very interesting. Just trying to get a cat off the table here. I really enjoyed that. It opens up all sorts of questions here on the, is there a progressive kernel of rebellious nationalism we can link up to? And, what do we do if the Labour Party is indeed dead? How do we replace it? The role of democratic demands is hugely important, I believe. So yes, I'm bringing in Peter Kennedy first with the first question. Hello, Peter.
Hi there. Thanks, Sandy and Steve. I've got a question that probably, kind of links into both of what you were saying, and you're talking about the working class, and both of you claim that the working class are going to benefit. Steve says the working class will benefit from an independent Scotland, and Sandy obviously thinks that will divide the working class in the UK and in Britain, make it more difficult for working class unity. When Marx, as far as I understand Marx, when he talked about the national question in Ireland, which Steve brought up, it wasn't so much like he was saying that the working class should take power in Ireland nationally, because he was against nationalism anyway. He was an internationalist. He was looking at it, as Steve started his talk, by noting, in terms of the ramifications for the breakup of the UK and for the, you know, the serious possible defeat that could have and weaken it could have on British imperialism. And I don't think he was kind of promoting the idea that you can have self-determination for working class people within nation states, no matter how small or big they are, or good or bad they are. So the key is working class, and I'd like to ask Steve whether he thinks the working class are promoting Scottish nationalism right now, because if they're not, they're going to be under some serious limitations if an independence ever come. Because as a nation, economics come into it. How do you manage your affairs economically? Will that have an impact on the working class? Will they be able to mobilize and use their democratic power to take over the constitution, right? And redefine it in their terms so that national economic frameworks like the management of money, fiscal policy, and so forth, and their social policy are not kind of tools with which to beat the working class down. So the key issue is, are the working class militant enough to try and work within a nationalist framework to overcome the kind of limitations on their progress, on the demands that they would naturally meet if they were in a powerful position within society. Sandy, on the other hand, I'd like to ask whether he thinks that
that was the case back in 2014, and it's continued to be the case since. And the case
Can you please turn off? I don't know who that is. Sorry, I'm muting everybody now. Go on.
Okay. Sandy, I'd just like to ask whether you have some idea that to keep the UK together as a you know, a kind of united, where it is right now, then how does that actually benefit the working class right now? And you know, it may sound like I'm swinging around and against my own argument, but it's still a national framework, the UK, and it's still tied to Westminster for all the reasons that Steve would point out. Westminster and its politics and the whole state institutions of Britain and the UK over many hundreds of years are a reactionary force, you know. So I'm wondering whether you've got like whether it's the Labour Party, whether you think that, well, if there's an independent Scotland, then not only can they manage their own affairs economically, you pointed out, but it will seriously weaken the Labour Party as a bulwark of working class change and revolution. Is that what you're saying? Because obviously if there's a breakup, it weakens the Labour Party both in Scotland and also in England, trying to secure a majority in both parliaments. So.
Thanks, Peter. Marie, please. Next. Hello.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, all good.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for this beautiful discussion. Now, if I understood well, there is a question arises: could Scotland continue on its wish to be a progressive country by itself? I accept that there is an element which is progressive, is in the SNP, and it showed in the very beginning when it started. I remember they had a program which included removing the NATO base, fast lane, having that removed, and there was something said against the monarchy. And there was 2 or 3 other elements I forgot now about the currency and the domination of England. And there was something anti-imperialist really about it. And also there was an aspect which was Republican, revolutionary sort of, which was very limitedly expressed and was very quickly erased. And I think the movement itself of the SNP is a bourgeois movement, but it has that nationalist aspect, which reminds me of the nationalist revolutionaries. Perhaps I'm exaggerating a bit, but in Latin America, you've got that a lot of, in Venezuela, the love of your country, the love of your nation in order to make it independent and sovereign, which contains the germs of not the socialist revolution, but of a transformation from nationalism to the revolutionary nationalist, in which in certain conditions, world conditions, could advance further. And I think this is how Cuba made it. It's true that Cuba is just turned by itself, and it managed to transform itself in an exceptional way. So it is not unachievable, but one has to take account of the world situation every time we look at everything. And Cuba comes in a context of world powers where imperialism was being defeated in its colonies. The colonial revolution became a nationalist and revolutionary, and Cuba followed in the wake of China and Russia and achieved more advances than Russia and China, because it was a fresh revolution which did not have the bureaucracy of the other two. And so it seems to me that to look at Scotland, we have to look at the world. The comrades have looked very well at all the parts of the British Isles. I think it needs to put back in its context. And I think perhaps the finest point I found in that discussion was when this matter was compared with Palestine, Kurdistan, Catalonia. In all these places, I don't know about Hong Kong, in all these places there are elements that are looking for the affirmation of democracy, in the sense of that you are no longer subjected to someone else. So in capitalism, there is only one way of relationships. There is only one sort of relationship: domination and subjection. There is nothing else. You look at in the human relations of capitalism, there is only these two principles. But those who actually established federations consciously with the deliberate intention to build a federation based on the equality of all its parts, that was achieved only by Russia and China, but particularly by the Soviet Union. So I think what we are hovering around a core, which is the socialist transformation of society, which we are not yet at the stage of. And so there are forces which are looking for it, which are seeking it. And now we have to look at what is happening in the next period. If I could say two more sentences, in the next period, thank you. In the next period, we have war coming. I don't know if you've noticed, I keep saying it, but I'm the only idiot who seems to have noticed that the war is being prepared, and one has to be quite blind not to see it, but no one ever in any meeting is mentioning it. But that is coloring what we are doing. What is happening now is that big transformations are coming. I do not believe that the structures as they are, the church and the monarchy and the House of Lords and all of this is going to resist the tremendous buffeting which is coming, which is going to bring onto the scene of history all sorts of forces, which include the millions who are going to be unemployed, who are unemployed now, and they are going to be dropped because capitalism is after money, not after rescuing workers. And so you can be sure that a big transformation is coming, and in there we should be posing. For example, I propose that LLA propose, or the comrades individually propose, removing that base in Fastlane. Why is it that we don't talk about it? And NATO, what's NATO doing up there? And also the domination, for example, did you see how Scotland was ignored over the question of when it came to fighting the virus, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland were ignored. The decisions were taken, and then these other parts were supposed to be just towing the line, which they didn't. I remember very clearly when, yeah, I finished now. I remember clearly when the SNP leader, the woman, I forgot her name, Sturgeon, when she said she didn't agree. She didn't agree with sending the children back to school, and she didn't agree with the change of slogans. And that there was something revolutionary in her action. She was in a position to do it, and she did. She said, no, we are not just your dependent. We are equals, or we are not at all partners.
Thank you, Marie. I'm going to have one more speaker from the floor, Pat Byrne, and then I'm going to bring in the main speakers, I suggest. Hello, Pat. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, just unmuting, yeah. Okay, comrades, Pat Byrne, Labour International, based over in Brazil, for my pains. I just quickly to say that please don't include Hong Kong in all these rebellious nationalisms, for God's sake. We haven't got time to go into that, but it is not a left-wing movement, I'm telling you. Anyway, so the thing about the talk that I think we've got to be very careful about this SNP. The SNP, as one of the comrades pointed out, they were for decades known as the Tartan Tories. They were a conservative organisation, and they used to take seats mainly off the Tories and occasionally off the Liberals. But what happened was that Labour moved so far away from the big working class constituencies in Scotland during the Blair years, that the SNP quite cleverly realised that there was a massive vacuum opening up, there was a market opening up, and they moved in to fill it. And that's why they came out, they became an anti-austerity party. And bit by bit, they started to gain more and more support among Labour voters. And this particularly accelerated after the fall of the discrediting of Labour in the big 2008-2009 recession and the fall of Labour from power. Then it just very quickly moved over, decisively over to the SNP. And this leaves Labour in a very difficult position because we're now going back into that situation that Starmer is going to be trying to move the party to the centre or even sometimes to the right. And this is again going to leave a space for the SNP to appear as a more radical party in Scotland. So that makes it very difficult for Labour to get anywhere. And as the comrade said quite correctly, they're caught between the two polarizations of British, English unionism and Scottish nationalism. What I'd like to say is this, that I think I pose a note of caution in this talk about the democratic questions, which are obviously crucial. I think, what do we mean by democratic questions? And I think that we often are getting dragged into these constitutional questions, which are moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. So basically, as Britain and Europe go down, as they decline economically, the more they adopt neoliberalism, as with growing inequality, the system starts degenerating. And then when you start to talk about, deciding you're going to get rid of the House of Lords, or you're going to devolve power to the regions of England, or you're going to devolve more power in Scotland, or Scotland become independent. They can become important in people's arguments, or whether, Britain stays in Europe and all these things. They can become important in political discourse, and they can get people excited and so on. But ultimately, they won't solve the problems of working people. And if Scotland does become independent, we will see very rapidly that the SNP will become the Conservative Party, effectively, of Scotland. And they will run Scotland because they're a neoliberal organisation. They're in with the big business. Even in the Parliament at the moment in Scotland, in Holyrood, they're often being the party that's imposing cuts and so on. And so I think Labour, if it's to survive, has to move to a new kind of democracy, and that's the key thing. Not this kind of, you know, rearranging who, you know, which representatives take decisions on your behalf that don't never ask you for your opinion. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, when did he call a conference in Scotland of the Labour movement to discuss the question? He just adopted the English Unionist position of staying with, I mean, that's, how democratic was that? And I think that we have to move towards a position of real reconsideration of what democracy is, and move to a real democracy where people are actually, they don't just elect people. First of all, the media. The media is as important as elections, because it's the media determines how you vote in many cases, because you don't know who you've got to vote for and the way it's presented. So we've got to democratize the media. We've got to not just have elections on the election day, but what about all the time in between? Because we elect politicians and they don't carry out the promises they make. And when new issues come up, they decide what they want. So we need to have a very radical different type of a democracy where the people are involved on a continuous basis and all the big decisions that affect their lives, they have a say in them as workers, as consumers, or whatever it might be. And that kind of approach to democracy, if we introduce that in the Scottish debate, it's no longer a question of just transferring the power from the English ruling class to the Scottish ruling class, the ruling elite, which is what's going to happen. We should be, that Labour and the left should be saying we want a totally different kind of, if you're going to go for Scotland as an independent country, or if it's going to be stayed separately, you know, stay as part of the English Union, whichever position you take on that, we've got to have power brought into the hands of the people. I remember I was brought up very much in the Irish traditions. My family's all Irish. And of course, James Connolly, you know, was one of my great heroes. You know, he participated in the nationalist movement, but he did it on the left-wing side. And he said, what's the benefit of us to, and he was proved right, of switching from a British flag to an Irish flag, and switching from a London ruling class to a Dublin ruling class. And that's the key question, I think, that we as socialists, that's what should distinguish us. Not just talking about democracy in the old way of just rearranging the constitutional things, but actually introducing a totally different form of democratic control.
Thank you, Pat. I believe they're both important questions. Abolishing the monarchy would be hugely important for the left. Anyway, I'm bringing in Sandy now to reply.
Can you hear me this time? Am I any clearer?
Yes, much better. Thank you, Sandy.
Okay. Well, the first thing is, I think what we need and what socialists should be fighting for is a workers' government, not a Scottish government, right? We need a government that represents the interests of the working class in transcending capitalism, and we need to build an international movement to transcend capitalism. And creating new borders or dividing the workers' movement into national groups is not a step forward towards the international unity of the working class. That's the crucial thing. In terms of democratic demands, I would support any democratic demands that increase the social weight of the working class, increase its cohesion, increase its socialist consciousness. So obviously we want to get rid of the monarchy. That's obvious. We have to fight for a republic, but we want a workers' republic. And I think the interests of the working class in Scotland is identical to the interests of the working class in the rest of this island. It is for unity in order to take forward the struggle for socialism. We don't need to support a new government in Scotland led by the Scottish boss class. That just leads us away from working class unity. So in no way do I defend the unity of the British state or the UK state. I defend the unity of the working class in fighting against capitalism. And that has got a 200-year history in Britain of workers coming together to try and win reforms, to try and improve living standards, and with the vanguard fighting for a workers' government that will take on the British capitalist class and overthrow it. And I think we are getting late in the day now for socialism, right? We can see the international crisis of capitalism is getting worse and worse, and nationalism is the response of the ruling class to keep the working class subservient We need to reject nationalism. We need to unite with workers in the rest of this island and in the rest of Europe to fight for a workers' government. And that is the way forward, I think. I think a federal republic, federal is a complete waste of time. Really, do we want to fight for an English parliament? In what way is that going to be advancing the interests of the working class? It would just really play into the hands of those that want to divide the working class into Scottish, English, Welsh, etc. We've got no interest in that. We've got an interest in uniting to have a workers' government in Britain that can take on capital. And that has to be the perspective. And anything that isn't that just plays into the hands of anti-working class forces. And you have to deal with things in the concrete. If Scotland voted for independence, there would be a really antagonistic negotiation to get Scottish independence about the division of assets and liabilities. It would involve other international forces being involved in either side, and the working class would be encouraged to support their own boss class, either down in England or up here in Scotland in those negotiations. The working class would not form itself into a collectivity to take on capital, and that's what we should be about. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sandy. Somebody's just asked there in the chat, how do we do it, Sandy? How do we get to the Workers' Republic? And, you know, some people think it is also includes taking national questions on. Anyway, I'll leave that to Steve to answer. Your life, but you're mute.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, first of all, Peter, I took notes. I hope I've got it right, Peter. I'll try to get it. So Peter basically said, will the working class benefit if Scotland becomes independent? And the answer, my answer to that is, well, we don't actually know, because if we could predict what would happen, that would be fine, but we can't predict. We can say that it has a potential to open up a political change. We can say that. But only if the working class itself gets involved, gets organized, builds its own party, builds its own trade unions, and gets active in the process, only then will it have a progressive outcome. So if the working class simply sits there passively watching what's going on and not getting involved, then you're absolutely right. It can't have a progressive outcome. The reactionary forces will be strong, the working class will be weak, and it won't go that way. But as socialists, what our purpose is say, this can have a progressive outcome. Let's go for it. Let's build a movement that can actually transform the process. So it's not automatic. You know, that would be deterministic. It can't be deterministic. It's actually, at the end of the day, depends on what people actually do and how they intervene. And our job as socialists is to work out the ways in which they should do that. I agree with you that national socialism, I totally oppose any idea of national socialism. The idea that Scotland could become a socialist society, something like that, I think is just for the birds. That's not the case. But even Russia in 1917 couldn't become a socialist society. That's only one part of world capitalism. But the point about Russia was it was a breach with the international system. It was a revolution where people came to power and it broke the system. If the system mended itself and then the whole counter-revolution came in on it, now obviously that's what can happen. That's why Lenin supported the 1916 uprising. He didn't think it was going to make Ireland a socialist country, but he thought it was a Republican, democratic, progressive thing that could trigger off revolutions in the rest of Europe. You could see the 1916 uprising as the beginning of the Russian Revolution, almost the first rebellion against the First World War. So we have to see these as chained and interconnected events, and revolutions as a process. And if the revolution starts, then people's consciousness will be changed by the revolution. The revolution will teach, and people will become different in the process as well. So we have to have those breaches, those breaks, those rebellions where different sections get power, you know, but we can't guarantee victory. We can't guarantee it'll all succeed, it'll all be happy ever after. For Marie, I had a lot of agreement with many of the things that Marie said, not least, of course, in raising the question of war. And I do talk about war, in becoming imperialist war. I think that's very important to see the global context for this. The war between China, the European Union and America. We can see the one between America and China going on, but the European Union is also part of that picture in a specific way. the SNP, and just talk about the SNP is not a Republican party. The SNP is a royalist party of Scotland. It wants to set up a new Scotland with Her Majesty still the head of state. So Labour Party could outdo that by becoming the Republican Party of Scotland. That was the point I was saying. If Labour could become the Republican Party of Scotland, then there is a political space for it. But that's never going to happen. So that's why it is a dead parrot. There is a space for it, but it can't occupy the space. To me, it's a dead parrot. It can't do. It's just and I think Pat said something about, or somebody said something about Starmer. You know where Starmer's taking it. He's just trying to. There's nowhere for him to go really. And he's not going to be able to revive the Labour Party. The two kinds of nationalism. I try to say the state nationalism of the existing order, and there are these rebellious nationalisms. But these rebellious nationalisms aren't good or bad. They are contradictions. They have a democratic element, which is where the working class has an interest. And they also have a reactionary element in there as well that could easily swing over. You can see that in Scottish nationalism. There are some sort of blood and whatever it is, nationalists in Scotland. I felt you probably know what blood and soil. That's the word I was looking for. Blood and soil. There are those kind of types on the fringe of the Scottish nationalist movement who hate the English, like to burn down some. But the movement as a whole, in that context, there is also a working class, democratic and socialist element in there. So obviously there's a battle goes on within the nationalist movement, which at the end of the day, the nationalist movement will blow apart. But it will blow apart only after it's achieved its whatever its aim is to do that. So we have to look at the democratic element. And I think that and this is where I think Sandy's weakness is. Sandy talks about Scotland purely in a British context. He doesn't think of Scotland in a European context. If you think of Scotland, the Republic, in a European context, then you can link Scotland to what's going on in Catalonia for a starter. And in Catalonia, you can see a national Republican movement in Catalonia coming into conflict with Spain's constitutional monarchy formed out of the Francoist Civil War, victory in the Civil War. So that is a whole thing there. And the links that have been made between Catalonia and Scotland show that why should Scotland limit itself to its whole focus is on what goes on in England? No particular reason why it should do that at all. And of course, Scotland can be seen as part of a wide world. It should be looked at in a world context. And that's, I still think, was the Marx's approach, to see something not in a purely narrow context, but in the wider European context. And I think he saw, I talked about Ireland in an English context, but also Ireland in a European context. Then he will link it up with Poland and other movements like that. Last point, I think, just try to see if I can get to what Pat said about democratic questions. I don't agree with him about Hong Kong, but that's another question that maybe should be discussed, because it obviously is a very important question. It seems to me that the people in Hong Kong are struggling. They don't have a democracy there, and they are struggling for democracy. But of course, the imperialist forces will try to exploit that in their war with China. So if you see it in the context of America and China, no doubt America would want to encourage that, because we encourage any problem in China's backyard. But that doesn't mean to say that we should say the people of Hong Kong have their democratic rights, because it might help America. You know, I mean, Germany did, the Kaiser did put Lenin in a train and send him on the train to St. Petersburg. Why did he do that? Because he thought it'd be advantage to German war effort if the Russian Revolution took place. But Lenin got there, and of course it wasn't to the advantage of Germany. Obviously, Lenin took that opportunity. So imperialists will always try to exploit anything. I think we have to side with the Hong Kong people and their demand for democratic rights. They don't have those democratic rights. But what Pat also said, I think there is a difference on democratic questions between democratic reforms and democratic revolutions. Okay. Democratic reforms mean basically tinkering within the existing constitution, like proportional representation, like devolution, like doing something with the House of Lords. It's taken them 300 years to do something with the House of Lords. It's very slow tinkering, incredibly slow. It'll take centuries to tinker around with anything and not really change it anyway. But a democratic revolution is basically you scrap the constitution. The constitution is blown away, and you say, we will now have another one. We will set up a constituent assembly, and we will now for ourselves decide what kind of democracy we want. And any democratic revolution throws itself up a constituent assembly with people starting to ask, what are the basic rules of the society that we want? And if Scotland did become independent, it would lead absolutely in the direction of a constituent assembly in Scotland. I can't see any other way to do it. And in this country, scrapping the constitution means republicanism. So what kind of democracy? Well, I think Pat said, what kind of democracy? So I would say, what kind of democracy should the Scottish Republic have? And Pat is saying it needs to take up all sorts of broad issues, different issues, and I completely agree with that. But if we don't have a Scottish Republic, those things are not really going to be on any serious political agenda. The Republic allows all those things to come out. It allows the flowering of popular sovereignty, popular demands. We saw a little bit in 2014, a movement there. And if Scotland became independent, we would see an upsurge of popular demands, working class demands, trade union demands. It would be like, I don't know what, it would be fantastic. Connolly, of course, was not just a nationalist. Connolly's approach was as a Republican. He saw the Republic as an opportunity to get Ireland to a workers' republic, the very republic that Sandy's talking about. But he had to get a republic first, Sandy, rather than think he can have it under our constitutional monarchy. A workers' government under a majesty just isn't going to work. Okay, finish there.
Thank you, Steve. We've had a couple of people indicating to speak, but two of them have vanished from the meeting. So I've got Matthew now, but if anybody else would like to speak, please could you click the button, raise hand, so that I can bring you in after Matthew. Or put your question in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, I just think it's been an interesting discussion. I think there's a sort of for me, there's various issues in there in terms of, both the nature of the nationalism and the sort of history of the Scottish Labour Party. For me, I think nationalism you can look at in various ways. And I think that people are getting confused in terms of understanding nationalism. Obviously, you've got the nationalism of existing imperialist countries. You've got nationalism as in, countries that are oppressed in one way or another, like Ireland. And what you now have, of course, is with the decline of capitalism, the system itself actually beginning to disintegrate, or substantially disintegrating in many ways. You have a nationalism of disintegration. I mean, you have bits of existing major capitalist countries saying, okay, we want out. Basically because of the impact of the move to finance capital by the ruling class. I mean, so Scotland has that nature. I mean, Scotland of course is integrated into an imperialist country. It's an imperialist operation. As you can look at Catalonia. I mean, Catalan nationalism is not particularly progressive in any way. I mean, one of its main slogans is we want to stop paying for these lazy Spaniards. It views itself as being, well, it is the richest part of the Spanish state. So, Scotland, of course, as I say, it's an effort in some ways to escape the effect of capitalism by erecting a border, which of course is a fantasy. The problem being, of course, is that as I say, it's not an oppressed country, and the immediate impact at the moment, of course, would be that Scotland would be entirely bankrupt. And the first thing that any government of an independent Scotland do would have to suppress the living standards of most of us who live here, which would be a pretty savage process. I think the other thing in those terms would be to look at the nature of the Scottish Labour Party. And the Scottish Labour Party, of course, has basically held power in Scotland, by itself, effectively from the 60s onwards, and was and maintained itself as an extremely right-wing outfit. If you look at the whole thing, going through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, I mean, it was extremely right-wing, and actually one of the reasons why it's in the state it's in at the moment, of course, is it systematically flung out the entirety of its left, or virtually the entirety of its left, in the 80s and 90s. Much of, there was a remnant of the left, but not much. Most of it was flung out. So you're right about this thing, which is is pretty right wing, And at the moment, of course, I agree with people saying, well, it can't actually move itself to the position it needs to move to because of its right-wing politics. I mean, clearly it's actually stuck in a position in which it's more likely to fall apart. At this point, you know, look, you can see it. I mean, it's like this death grip of the right wing. You know, it's astonishing place to have to go to meetings or whatever or talk to these people because, of, you know, clearly they've got no future. The thing is, you know, that what you then had, of course, in the 90s, of course, was this astonishing move by the left, that actually the left itself lost its. I mean, the basic thing about being on the left or being a socialist, you know, is to say, well, your faith is in the ruling, is in the working class. The working class is the force that will change society. And essentially, what happened was that over the period of the 90s, was of course a whole series of organisations, particularly those people coming out of the militant, and then subsequently people with the SWP, decided that in fact no, it was actually. The working class had nothing to say, and effectively they said, well, you know, the whole thing is going to be decided by some generosity of the bourgeoisie in Scotland, which is an extraordinary position, because I can't see how the bourgeoisie in Scotland is going to be particularly more generous than any other bourgeoisie anywhere else. You know, they're not proving themselves to be at any other point in history. You know, so that then, of course, then allows the growth, actually promotes the growth of nationalism, you know, under conditions in which you have, you know, a crisis of politics. You know, I mean, the working class does, for rightly and for you know, the whole period of history, hate the Scottish Labour Party. I mean, you know, you can go in the streets here and you can speak to lots of people who tell you that, you know, for very good reasons. And so you know, the fact that the nationalism has been promoted not merely by the SNP, which is a pretty right-wing outfit anyway, but also by a whole chunk of the previously you know, what was previously the revolutionary left, you know, is why you have the position you sit in at the moment. I think that the other thing, of course, is actually to understand. I mean, what what Trotsky came out with, and I think holds good until at this point, of course, is that in 1905 is, of course, that he after having seen what happened in 1905, his conclusion in Results and Prospects and Permanent Revolution was that actually the bourgeoisie has no progressive role in society left, and everything's left to the working class. And the problem is, of course, that you've now got this sort of lock. You know, the fact that the working class itself has not actually generated a political force capable of resolving the position. So what we're getting is a situation of rot, you know, and decline, both in economics and socially and politically. And the phenomenon of Scottish nationalism actually is a product of that sort of decline and rot of both society and politics, and it's for the left actually to say, well, you know, we require a different solution, which, I mean, you know, obviously then has to be, I mean, not merely at a British level, but at a European level. And the question is how it is to build a socialist alternative on a European level, for me anyway. So I mean, you know, I think that really we're almost caught at this point. I think that the good news for me is really the movement in the US. I think that you're starting to see a movement in terms of the main imperialist country, a movement which has been stymied over a whole period. And I think that the question really then is, how does the left itself then generate something which is not engaged in producing borders, is engaged in producing a class struggle and can generate organisations which can actually win. I mean, the problem we also have, of course, is that most of the organisations we're using at the moment, and not only the Labour Party but also the unions, are incapable of actually delivering anything to the working class as a whole, and don't have any. It can't stand up in front of people and say, well, look, we can do this, and we can change this, and all this, and then have any credibility. So I mean, it's really I mean, it's very difficult for us here in Scotland, I think. But you know, we'll keep trying.
Thank you, Matthew. No doubt. Ian, do you still want to speak? If so, I'll spotlight you now.
Aye.
Yeah.
Yeah. On independence, I think the first thing that has to be said is that it may come. I saw one of the more intellectually honest arguments in favour of independence just the other day on account of this poll that's putting it to 54% and whatnot, saying it's a matter of if but not when. I don't think that's completely right, but it's certainly been made more likely by the events of the last few months. But the question is, should we support that as socialists? I think it's a symptom of the decomposition of politics and the 40 years of attacks by Thatcherism, Blair's wrecking of the Labour Party, to an extent the Brexit result, which also in some ways resembles, and now, of course, the defeat of Corbynism. I opposed independence in 2014 when I wasn't even a Labour Party member yet, on the basis that I was for an all-British movement for socialism. That was my main argument against it, at least. And at that time, it seemed like that was something that would take some time to build. And then within a year, it was here. And now it's, for a time at least, been smashed. So the struggle ebbs and flows all the time. And now on top of the Labour Party being set back and the left within the Labour Party being set back within it, you've got the Tory government failing its first test more disastrously perhaps even than we'd have thought, and it's been a more extreme situation than even we thought was going to happen in the immediate aftermath of Brexit. So you've got Johnson as one of the worst in the whole world, up there with Trump and Bolsonaro on COVID, making Sturgeon look good in comparison. But she's actually marched more or less in lockstep with the Tories, sometimes made a big deal out of doing things, the same things, but 10 or 11 days later, as if that's a fundamental break from the Tories in terms of the lockdowns. Radiated a slightly more empathetic, well, actually a lot more empathetic than Johnson and Dominic Cummings, but attitude towards this, but that's easy compared to them. And so she's possibly had the best pandemic of any politician in the world, apart from perhaps Joe Biden, that just a couple of months ago, it looked like the SNP might even split, Sturgeon versus Salmond, former First Minister and leader of the SNP, facing serious criminal charges and then getting found not guilty, and all sorts of talk about where that was coming from politically, which could still come back to haunt them. But if it hadn't been for COVID breaking out at exactly that time, there might have been two SNPs, or at least a very serious fight within the SNP at the present time. Instead, it's on if 54% in the polls for independence and slightly more than that for the party itself. And on current trends, set to win 74 out of 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament next year. So this has been a real Deus Ex Machina for Sturgeon. I don't know how long it will last, but we're in a precarious situation that everything seems to be running against us. The defeat of Labour, the defeat of Corbynism within Labour, and now the pandemic accentuating these differences between the nations. But it is a symptom, it's not a cure, this issue of independence. Unless I believe that being Scottish was itself a rebellious act against capitalist oppression, I'd find it always hard to back independence. However much of a tactical issue in some senses it is. But we have to maintain the unity of our class, despite all of the degradation that independence and Brexit is a symptom of. There's other symptoms of the malaise of politics, obviously, that are opening to us. Jeremy Corbyn getting on the ballot and then doing so well and becoming a leader. Bernie Sanders doing so well. Then there's things that obviously nobody could possibly support on the left. And independence, in a way, it's something that's in between. In a way, it's a revolt of the centre against the hard right, at least currently. That's why I mentioned Joe Biden having a good pandemic along with Sturgeon. These right-wing populist clowns, Trump and Johnson, with the fascist Bolsonaro being the only one who's even worse than them, have really shown themselves up with this pandemic. And if Trump loses in a landslide to a block of wood, releasing tapes from his basement and doing little else in the campaign, that would of course be a good thing because Trump's lost. But it's also a very bad thing that Biden defeated Bernie Sanders and got no illusions whatsoever in him as a president. So independence could be used as a protest vote against these Tories, but unlike a 4-year here today, gone tomorrow, particularly here today, gone tomorrow, perhaps in Joe Biden's case, politician, independence would be with us for a very long time. And as Matthew was saying, we'd be made to pay for it. We'd have the Brexit costs, on top of which the pandemic costs, on top of which the green paper that the SNP released, the Growth Commission, with Fred Goodwin of Royal Bank of Scotland's former spin doctor, who was also for a time an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament, as one of the top people on the panel drawing it up, calling for a decade of austerity in response to independence in order to fund setting up the country. So we're already threatened with a decade of austerity because of the COVID. We've got the situation in the UK as a whole where now the COVID costs will be so high that some of the hard Brexiteers are hoping that the costs of a no deal, if that's what happens, could be hidden within them. So who knows how it will go? Will we be more canny, more risk averse in terms of taking on the cost of independence when we've got these already double whammy costs coming down the line from the Tories, or will it almost seem like we're damned if we do, damned if we don't? But I think the socialist position still has to be against independence. It might come, we might have to deal with it. I think if we're to take it off the agenda long term, we have to get the Labour Party's act together in Scotland, but also in the UK, bring back that pole of hope on a British level that we had when there was Jeremy Corbyn. And in the meantime, we have to make the hard argument against both the populist right Johnsonite nationalism, but also this kind of default protest vote against it in Scotland, which is sort of a Bidenite nationalism, if I can coin the phrase of Nicola Sturgeon. That's part of what was, by the way, in the background of our falling out with Alex Salmond. I mean, it's been, I think, exaggerated by Salmond supporters how radical he was, but Sturgeon is a complete creature of the status quo. Oh, and one last thing on the COVID situation that's really fueled the immediate issue of independence. The English Westminster government response to COVID has been so bad, it's created a situation where you can make the medical case perhaps for quarantining people coming into Scotland from England. Though I do see a lot of the people making that case as some of the most ugly side of nationalism, standing on the border, English route, keep Scotland COVID free in their hazmat suits, shouting at people in their cars coming in from England, especially when flights are landing and not getting quarantined. And even people like Devi Sridhar, who's been a good voice of sense on the coronavirus in the national UK media, got into a bit of trouble talking about anti-Scottish people criticising Sturgeon. Then she said, actually on Twitter, I meant to say anti-Scottish independence. And that might even be true. But in a way, it's worse that a doctor is saying the only reason you'd be wanting to hold this government to account that admittedly isn't as bad as Johnson, but certainly hasn't got everything right, largely because it's done so much that's similar to Westminster. Even within the powers of devolution, it could have diverged a lot more. And
Ian, can you...
So yeah, this COVID conjuncture, I think, is particularly driving the national antagonism that the SNP is feeding off. But I think we have to hold our nerve and push back against that, even where it might be unpopular for a time. And even the most pessimistic people say the virus won't be with us forever. But we have to fight to make sure that nationalist divisions of the working class aren't with us forever either. Sorry, I've gone on a bit. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. Mark Metcalf, please. Hello.
Good evening, everybody. There's huge amount of contradictions, aren't there, in this discussion to some extent. Firstly, throughout my life, I've always been in favour of the Scots' right to independence. However, unlike the situation in around Ireland, where I've worked consistently amongst the English working class for that to become a possibility, raising the position of troops out, self-determination for the Irish. That's not a position in Scotland which I've vigorously campaigned for amongst English working class people. I've just accepted the political position that the Scots have a right for self-determination and independence if they vote for that. There's a small number of things. Firstly, not all nationalisms are regressive. So, for example, I've always supported the rights of the Kurds for a independent nation, and the great colonial movements of Africa and other places, and the independence and those sorts of things. Most people would support them, and they support it not because those places are going to become socialists, because they have a kernel of radical change in essence. And we fight at the moment, let's be honest about this, it's interesting that most of the socialist left in this country campaigned to come out of the European Union. They sought to build basically a form of socialism in one nation. That's basically what was happening. It was going back to the British road to socialism. Frankly, such an objective is absolutely absurd. The reality is that Britain has faced a choice for a long time as a declining imperialist power, and working class people in this country were persuaded by seriously reactionary elements to go with the what you describe as the ultra-right capitalist aspects of this, which is American capitalism, rather than remain within the European Union, where it would have been possible to have put socialists into the European Parliament and to have canvassed for a socialist federation of states. And when that was not possible, to have broken the European Union through that position. Let's make no bones about it. We were not electing Jeremy Corbyn, if we had elected him, to bring about any form of socialism across these islands. He would have been closed down almost immediately. It would have been a fight basically to have adopted any forms of progressive elements with his particular programme. There's no question about that. Up in Scotland, for example, I hear the things that's been said. The reality is that, you know, I mean, I went to the Labour Party conference. I was a delegate at the Labour Party conference. And one of the things which was most obvious sitting there looking, I was at the front, very close to the front, was that there were two separate groups of people getting up to speak, okay? There were large numbers of youngish women across England from migrant backgrounds who were getting up and speak. There were only, in the whole time I was there, 2 speakers from Scotland. Only 2 delegates spoke in the whole of the 3 days I was there. I was there the Sunday, the Monday and the Tuesday. I had to come up to London, so perhaps they spoke on the Wednesday. So there was no representation of the working class, even under Corbyn, within the Labour Party, certainly not at the conference. So that tells you a great deal about what the working class thinks, even of Corbyn, in my particular view. The point I want to make, in a way, is that the issue of Brexit, okay, is what do the speakers think should be the case? So in a situation where Johnson goes for, say, trying to remove the rights, of the rights which workers currently do, to some extent, have as a result of Britain's being within the European Union, should Scottish socialists and others urge them to suck it and just go, well, that's part of the process of coming out? Or are they going to be in a position to say, well, actually in Scotland, the Scots, having voted for this, should be given that opportunity to remain within the European Union? Should they be able to protect some of those situations? So there's a huge amount of contradictions, and I appreciate I'm not answering any of these myself in terms of the situation. Finally, okay, which I do think answers some of my own contradictions, is if the British state breaks up, which is the possibility which exists, right? That British state has historically gone all over the world, and our standards of living are built on the oppression of overseas workers, okay? So everywhere where you think, the Yemen, all these places. So surely the destruction of that British state may make it possible for those workers and else to basically take forward some of their demands. Perhaps it won't, but that is what the possibilities are which emerge. Certainly the continuing existence of the British state as it is at this moment does not appear to me to be under any serious challenge, sadly, from the working class's point of view. And the fact of the matter is Corbyn and the trade union movement can't answer those questions because of the fact that Britain is stuck in the middle between American capitalism and European capitalism. So I'm not suggesting we go on our own, and I'd appreciate I've answered lots of questions. Finally, if anybody can find any dentist that's open to see through my teeth before September, just send me the details. Otherwise, I'll have lost my teeth as a result of this.
God.
Your time.
Still going on. Oh my word. Sorry to hear that, Mark.
Well,
thanks for your contribution.
See you later. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to bring in Sandy now again as the first speaker to sum up the discussion and maybe bring some kind of conclusion. I should say that, of course, the Labour Left Alliance is an all-British organisation. And I should also point out that things can change quite quickly. I think comrades who are quick to dismiss the Labour Party as dead, things like Corbynism can happen again, and especially when things are changing quite quickly in the economic disaster that will be upon us. Anyway, Sandy, please. Thank you.
Okay, just a comrade that just spoke asked one or two questions. One, I would just say that certainly quite a few of us in Scotland campaigned for a Remain position, a socialist Remain position. We certainly didn't go along with the British nationalist arguments that we've got to take back control, etc. Right? I think there are some similarities between that argument and what you get from some Scottish nationalists, this take back control idea. Anyhow, I think the important thing for socialists, one, is to argue for socialism and stop arguing for other issues, right? We want the working class to take power, to take over industry and the means of production and run them democratically. And we want that done on an international scale. And we have to start talking about that and putting that forward as a solution to the crisis, not some nationalist breakaway. Right, sometimes the left people that support independence in Scotland say, look, one of the important and best things about Scottish independence, it would lead to the breakup of British imperialism, and therefore that would aid the working class internationally. Now, I think that is just a mistaken position. I think obviously we have to oppose British imperialism, but the main opponent of British imperialism in Britain is the working class movement, at least the socialist aspect of the working class movement. And that we don't want to see weakened, and that would be weakened, I think, by a Scottish independence. And there's absolutely no evidence that if we had Scottish independence, that, you know, the new Scottish state would be part of NATO, and it would be an imperialist state, and it would be giving aid to the rest of the UK that still exists. And they would be doing joint projects in order to defend imperialism. There's absolutely nothing anti-imperialist about the SNP, or in fact about the movement for independence. It is very much within the concept of an independent capitalist Britain, and you'd still have all the investments abroad, and they'd still be supporting, if there needs to be troops to go abroad, the SNP would, I believe, support that, right? So I don't see the nationalist breakup of Britain as being something positive. I certainly say that the British state is the enemy of all socialists, not only in Britain but internationally, but we want to not just dismember that or cut that state up. We want to see the working class overthrow that state and have a socialist society that links up with the forces in Europe, etc. And I do accept that any idea, I mean, obviously any idea of socialism in Scotland itself is ridiculous, right? But also you can't have socialism in Britain. It has to be an international movement. But I could envisage the possibility of the working class taking power in Britain, but it would have to be very quickly followed by a spread of the revolution throughout Europe, or we would be defeated. But I cannot imagine a situation where the working class in Scotland could take power when there was still a capitalist state in London. I mean, what are the capitalist class in London going to do? Just watch what's happening in Scotland in the TV? They'd be intervening with their army, etc., to make sure. And more importantly, the SNP is a very conservative force. The Scottish nationalist movement is very conservative, very pro-British Army, very pro the Scottish regiments, etc. They are in no way out to disturb the rule of capitalism. That they would run 500 miles in the opposite direction if there was a real working class movement fighting for Scottish independence, which there isn't. I would immediately say if there was a working class movement fighting for Scottish independence, their main allies would be the working class in the rest of Britain. So why would you go for Scottish independence? You'd be fighting for a British Republic, linking up with the working class in the rest of Europe. That is the basic strategy that socialists have to fight for. A workers' government is part of the move towards international socialism. I don't see any progressive potential in the move for Scottish independence, right? I just, having observed what the SNP is and the forces that are involved, very, very conservative forces. So I don't see it can be a trigger for a revolution in Britain. Having said that, you do have to defend the right of the Scottish people to vote for independence if they want to go down that route. But I think, as I've said, if you had an independent Scotland, can you imagine what the negotiations will be like over assets and liability with Westminster? On both sides, there would be chauvinists trying to stir up national division, and that is not a good position for socialists. We don't want to be in the position where that's happening. We want to emphasise from day one, our interests are the same of the working class in Glasgow is the same as the interests of the working class in London, Liverpool, etc. And we need a united organisation to fight for those interests. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. Steve, please. Steve, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself, though.
There we go.
Yeah.
I did want to say something about, you know, I said we should go back to the beginning where the whole thing started. So, and I didn't get to take that, but I do want to say that now. I'll just throw that in. The Act of Union of 1707 was done for 4 reasons. It was to cement in the new constitutional structure of a Protestant state with a constitutional monarchy as a union state. Now, a union state is not a federal state. A union state has one parliament, that's in Westminster. It doesn't have any other parliaments. It's not a federation. So it was formed as a union state. And it was done to make sure by Queen Anne that their Protestant succession would be guaranteed, that Scotland couldn't be used as a base for the arch enemy France at the time, could invade England via Scotland, that the union would last forever It's actually written in there, there will never be any breakaway out of this union. It's there forever. And that there would be the abolition of the Scottish Parliament, because Queen Anne did not want to have the idea that the Scottish people might elect this Parliament. They might start doing all sorts of rebellious, trouble-causing things, you know. Something that could be a rival to Westminster. So those are the points of the Act of Union. And the Scottish elites went along with it, were bribed by it, were feared by it, because they wanted to have access to the colonies, the English colonies, and to the massively profitable slave trade. So it was a reactionary thing done to support the ruling class. And in a way, the Scottish people at the time didn't support it, by the way. They were rioting in the streets against it. With the passage of time and the empire, the whole thing became absorbed. The Act of Union, therefore, was still in place until 1997, when Tony Blair brought back the Scottish Parliament. That's a breach with a term. One of the terms is a reform of the Act of Union because it allows Scotland to have a parliament. And that's the beginning of this whole turn that has taken place. The Scottish Parliament has allowed the Scottish people to have a voice, but a very limited voice. And they're very jealous of it there. They're completely worried about it. And then, of course, the next thing was David Cameron in 2014 gave the possibility that Scotland might become independent, which is another potential breach of the Act of Union that says that Scotland must be forever tied to England. So the Act of Union is actually being kind of reformed, being kind of undermined, but it's not becoming stabilised by this. It's becoming more and more unstable. So what Scotland is doing is undermining the constitutional settlement upon which the British state is made. That's why it has implications for England and not just for Scotland. Now, leave that aside for a minute. I want to just say something. Let's try and see what a couple of comments on some things other people have said. Mark, hi, Mark. I haven't seen you for ages. Nice to see you again. I agree with Mark. The rights of nations to self-determination. I think Sandy agreed with that, and I agree with that. The question is whether Scottish independence would be progressive or democratic. And Mark spoke about Kurdistan having a radical democracy, Catalonia, etc., etc. It seemed to imply that Scotland's not oppressed unless England sends in troops. If England sends troops to Scotland, then Scotland becomes impressed and then we can support it. But as long as England don't send any troops, Scotland doesn't really have, it wouldn't be progressive for Scotland to set up its own republic or have its own democracy or do any of these things unless English troops appeared on the borders. I don't accept that at all. The denial of your right to self-determination is itself a form of political oppression. Scotland is not an equal partner of England in the Union, and you look back at the Treaty of 1707 to find out the law that actually established that. Scotland was never an equal partner with England in that whole thing. It was never equal, and doesn't remain equal to this day. I would say, because I think it was Matthew said something like, well, the Scottish people don't want to erect borders, you know, why do they want to have a border? But you've got to remember that Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, so they didn't want a border with England, they didn't want a border with France, they didn't want a border with Ireland, they didn't want a border with Germany, they didn't want a border with Norway. They're going to have those borders imposed upon them by the Westminster government, despite the fact they voted not to do that. So they're having borders right now, instead of protesting about, well, we don't want to have a border with England. Scotland could have become independent if we're all in the European Union, and there would have been no border between England and Scotland, by the way. It's Brexit, by the way, just to say that, Mark, it's Brexit that's transformed that situation, and it means that a whole new set of borders have to be, which the Scottish people are not in favour of, by the way. Black Lives Matter, somebody mentioned that. Black Lives Matter, if you start to trace back Black Lives Matter, it goes back to the American Constitution. It goes back to the fact that America was established as a slave republic, but based on white power, if you want to put it like that. And it's not really changed fundamentally since that Constitution was set up. And you can have this reform and that reform, and there have been many, many reforms, but if you don't fundamentally change the laws and Constitution of the United States of America, there will be no equality for black people in America. This is only a repeat of something that's happened before. And until people see it's a political, legal, and constitutional question that you have to change. It's the American Constitution. And if you just remain tinkering about with this and that reform, this a bit of democratic reform here, a bit of democratic, it's not going to fundamentally change the fact that America was established as a slave republic. And even despite the Civil War, hasn't fundamentally changed from that date. And that's why, in a sense, you need a democratic revolution in America if you really want to change and get equal rights between people and rights for working class people in America, and not this republic that they established many years ago. So these protest movements have to become democratic movements, and they have to become even movements for democratic change and democratic revolution. And if they don't become that, then they just sink back again after a while. And that's that same perspective I should think should inform Scotland. A lot of the argument, I'll maybe finish on this point. A lot of the argument seems to be that the SNP is a capitalist party. It's not that progressive. It's a centre party as opposed to the Tories or right-wing party, blah, blah, blah. But this isn't the point, really. This is to fundamentally miss the point. The real point is, what is the working class going to do about it? Can the working class form its own independent party, or is it just going to sit there watching what the SNP does and go, well, the SNP is not doing anything for us? Of course the SNP isn't going to do anything. The SNP will be in charge of the whole situation unless the working class organise its own political democratic party in Scotland to challenge the SNP from the left. And that party doesn't exist in Scotland. And the Labour Party can't fill that space either, for the reasons that I've already argued. So there is a massive vacuum. And what we should be talking about is the activity of the working class, the political action of the working class, not the passivity. You know, and when Ian, I think it was Ian, when Ian was talking, at the end of the day, it still came back to the fact the Scottish working class is weak, the Scottish working class can't do anything. Why change anything? It ultimately comes back to being conservative, where what we need to do is to mobilise the democratic movement, to mobilise a party, that's the line we've got to. It doesn't exist at the moment, but that's the line of march that we have to take. So I'm optimistic about the present situation. I think what COVID, I'll finish on this point, what COVID has done has shown that the British state is absolutely bankrupted completely. It's exposed it to a far wider group of people than just the usual left-wing people. And I think the consequence of that is the British state is bankrupt, it's degenerate, and it can't solve any of the problems. And I think that's why you will see these movements in Scotland, Wales, for that matter, and Ireland will be growing in the next period. No, I'll finish there. Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. I enjoyed that debate very much. Clearly, we have a problem with a subjective factor, i.e. the working class movement, and where is it? And now that, you know, the huge chance that Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, presented us with has been squandered quite sadly and badly, I think, avoidably so in many respects. I think lots of mistakes were made, that we've been discussing those as well. And for me personally, I always thought the question of the Federal Republic, the demand, is actually quite a clever one, in that it takes it out of the hands of the nationalists. If we get behind it, if the working class in England, in Wales, gets behind this, something that Steve mentioned in the earlier introduction, if we get behind the demand for a federal republic, including separation, would perhaps be the best way to avoid such separation, by saying to our comrades in Scotland, we do take it seriously, we understand there's a democratic deficit, we do take it seriously, and we take it out of the hand of the SNP. We avoid that way to present themselves as the progressives, or the ones who take working class people seriously. But you know, that's certainly something I would be arguing if the LLA ever turns into some kind of a party or something more. Emma, I'm talking, sorry, my daughter's nagging me. Okay, thanks very much for everybody that come along. We'll be putting this up online as soon as possible, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.